According to the New York Times, when Vice President-elect Kamala Harris was the district attorney of San Francisco, she liked to refer to herself as a progressive prosecutor, or maybe even as the progressive prosecutor. When she ran for president, and then after she was selected as Joe Biden's running mate, this claim was scrutinized and found wanting by many. Her critics pointed to the many cases wherein she suppressed evidence and sent innocent people to jail, and to her support for a law that criminalized truancy and made parents of truant children subject to prosecution. Both examples were touted as evidence that this designation as a progressive prosecutor was inappropriate and untrue. However, in this video, we'll argue that the designation is appropriate and that the American left needs to rethink and reconceive its own history. By taking up the arguments put forward in Christopher Lasch's books, The Agony of the Left and The Culture of Narcissism, we'll try to understand how Kamala Harris, far from breaking from the progressive tradition, embodies it in all its contradictions. Hello, Zero Books readers and viewers. It's me again, Douglas Lane. And in this video, we'll take a look at the history of what Mark Fisher called capitalist realism, as we examine some of the ideas from two of Christopher Lasch's books, The Agony of the Left and The Culture of Narcissism. We'll try to summarize the arguments Lasch made throughout his career as a social critic, even as we attempt to correct some of those assumptions. So in the next month, we'll be exploring the ideas of Christopher Lasch. If you enjoy these videos, you should click on the subscribe button and hit that bell. Even better, you should support us on Patreon. Patreon supporters get access to our Parrot Room, or private podcast conversations, as well as to podcasts about Rosa Luxemburg's Reform and Revolution, Gilles Dauvé's From Crisis to Communization, and Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. Support us on Patreon and join us in learning critical theory with the aim of changing society. In 1969, the historian and social critic Christopher Lasch published The Agony of the Left, a book that told the story of the American left and of the American left's decline. In it, he spelled out how a bureaucratic elite slowly transformed American institutions like the courts and the schools in order to adapt the population to the rising power of industrial corporate capitalism. He wrote, "The dominant liberalism, which most historians have mistakenly seen as the principal 20th century manifestation of popular democracy, actually served the needs of the industrial system. Progressivism, except when it was informed by socialist or populist perspectives, was progressive chiefly in attacking the archaic entrepreneurial capitalism, the existence of which impeded the rationalization of American industry. The aim of the progressives was to refine the mechanism of social control, and, whenever possible, to invent more humane, open, and nonviolent methods for directing and shaping the unwashed and backwards masses." In his book, The Culture of Narcissism, Lasch spends chapters outlining how the American public school systems shifted away from the aim of imparting critical thinking and intellectual mastery, and towards the aim of providing a time of passivity and socialization. The progressives, and even many to their left, took up conservative assumptions as they expanded and opened the educational system to the masses, insisting on the one hand that everyone had a natural right to education, while admitting that most of the poor, the immigrants, had no hope of ever really learning. The life of the mind, of reason, was not for everyone. But if Johnny couldn't be taught to think, he could at least be taught to read well enough to follow instructions. And if true literacy and historical understanding was slipping away from even elite students as early as 1940, then the teaching of morality, of manners, and of self-expression might as well take the place of traditional book learning. By then, the most progressive educators were advocating for teaching life adjustment far more often than they were advocating for teaching the great books or Greek. Those who were struggling over how to educate the masses came to a compromise. Industry no longer required workers to hold an array of talents and abilities. They no longer required mostly skilled workers, but rather wanted docile, semi-skilled, and unskilled workers for the factories. Progressives, meanwhile, no longer trusted everyday people to make sense of their own lives, but were ready to step in and do their students' thinking for them. Rather than offering challenging work without any immediate interest, life adjustment education promised to be student-centered, even as it abandoned the project of fostering the development of independence and mastery. When considered through the lens of the actual history of progressivism, it's easier to see why Kamala Harris felt she could conjoin the words progressive with prosecutor. Seen this way, the tension between the progressive and the prosecutor disappears, at least partially. The existence and feasibility of a centrist progressive type, a tough-minded person who is occasionally willing to abandon his or her commitment to the humane treatment of the masses when such commitment gets in the way of efficiency and institutional needs, becomes obvious. What is less obvious, however, is how a left that had aligned itself with socialism or populism in the early part of the 20th century could settle for progressivism after the Second World War. As I have been rereading The Culture of Narcissism and The Agony of the American Left, I found myself in easy agreement with Lasch as he described how American socialism went off the rails in the early 20th century. Juxtaposing the IWW against the almost forgotten American Socialist Party, the romantic radicalism of the Wobblies against the workaday reformist politics of the SPA, he suggests that the triumph of the Romantics, with their appeals to direct action and dual unionism, along with the American left's optimistic embrace of Bolshevik strategies after 1917, led to the dissolution of socialism in America and cleared a space for a regression into a deeply authoritarian politics, an authoritarian mode best understood as a kind of progressivism. However, it's important to remember that Lasch is siding with the socialist tendencies that were conceived of at the time as right-wing. And in this thoroughly post-Bolshevik era, even the left within the Socialist Party that advocated for the creation of socialist unions, who argued for the creation of political unions that could support a party that would be elected into power and that would then implement a socialist platform and break with capitalism through this electoral strategy, even this would be considered hopelessly reformist by most remaining Marxist sects. Lasch is to the right of these early 20th century Americans who predated Lenin, and his advocacy for meeting the workers where they lived, for limiting union activity to the level of supporting demands that were immediately relevant to the lives of the rank and file, while running the Socialist Party as a strictly political effort, can easily be seen, or at least taken to be, an example of opportunism. There is a dilemma at the center of Lasch's history of the American left, a dilemma that in the European context was framed around the question of reform or revolution, but that I tend to think of as a question of determinism versus voluntarism. That is, if we conceive of socialism as a society that will be built by an emancipated working class, a working class that will emancipate itself after the contradictions within capitalism push it into taking political action, then we are determinist. If, on the other hand, we see socialism as arriving through a process of party building and political action, a process led by an educated elite within or even without of the working class. If we hold that education, consciousness raising, and the development of a party is the revolutionary task of a vanguard, then we hold with a voluntarist line. One thing is certain, however, the historic failure to resolve debates about how conscious socialists should relate to the working class have always come along with crises within capitalism and have always been experienced as political and institutional defeats when considered practically. and as American socialists face the aftermath of the Trump years. As we continue to take in the reality of the defeat that the latest iteration of social democratic socialism suffered, we can find more truth in the work of Christopher Lasch than we find error. When we consider that Kamala Harris was a red diaper baby, and especially when we realize that her father, Donald Harris, was heavily influenced by Sraffa, an economist who was identified with David Ricardo as opposed to Marx, we might look for the points of agreement between Harris and Lasch, even as we notice how easily Lasch's critiques of progressive elites can be applied to our new vice president-elect. To be more direct, what still has to be considered is the American socialist tradition that includes Lasch. And given its dismal state, we should be ready to return to basics, and even risk a return to Marx. And that's what we'll do next week as we continue on with this agony called the left. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.